In the infinite cosmos of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse, where chaos and law wage eternal conflict across countless planes of existence, there exists a race so perfectly ordered, so absolutely synchronized in their devotion to structure, that they challenge every assumption about what it means to be alive. These are the Modrons, the clockwork enigmas of Mechanus, creatures whose very existence represents a paradox wrapped in gears and angles, whose society operates according to principles so alien that even the most learned planar scholars struggle to comprehend their true nature. At first glance, the Modrons appear to be nothing more than ambulatory mechanisms, constructs of metal and mathematics given the semblance of motion. Adventurers encountering these geometric beings in the interlocking gears of their home plane often make the fatal mistake of dismissing them as mere automatons, simple machines following simple programming. This assumption could not be further from the truth. The Modrons represent something far stranger, far more unsettling than any conventional construct. They are living proof that the boundaries between the mechanical and the biological, between the artificial and the natural, are not as clear as mortal minds might wish to believe. The Modrons dwell in Regulus, a specific realm carved from the infinite expanse of Mechanus, the outer plane of absolute law and perfect order. Within this domain of mathematical precision, they maintain control over exactly 64 cogs, not 63, not 65, but precisely 64, a number that never wavers, never shifts, never deviates by even a single gear. This unwavering constancy in all things defines the Modron existence. Where other societies might expand or contract based on circumstances, where other civilizations might adapt their territories to suit changing needs, the Modrons remain absolutely fixed in their cosmic arrangement. The number 64 is not a goal or an average. It is an immutable fact of their existence, as unchangeable as the laws of mathematics themselves. Understanding the Modrons requires abandoning conventional frameworks for comprehending intelligent life. These beings do not simply prefer order, they are order made manifest. Their society operates according to principles that seem to defy the very concept of individual agency, as most creatures understand it. Yet to call them mindless would be profoundly incorrect. The Modrons possess intelligence, purpose, and a form of motivation that drives their actions. That this intelligence expresses itself in ways utterly foreign to mortal comprehension does not diminish its reality. It simply marks the Modrons as one of the most alien intelligences in all the planes. The exploration of Modron nature reveals layers of contradiction and complexity that challenge planar taxonomy at its foundations. Here are creatures that look like constructs, but breathe like living beings. Here is a society that embodies law, yet shows no interest in enforcing it beyond their borders. Here exists a race simultaneously biological and mechanical, isolationist yet positioned at the heart of one of the multiverse's most significant planes. To understand the Modrons is to peer into a mirror that reflects back something fundamentally other, something that operates according to an internal logic so perfect and complete that it needs no external validation or interaction. This examination will peel back the layers of Modron existence, exploring the biological truths hidden beneath their mechanical exteriors, the precise nature of their territorial domain, the philosophy that drives their isolationist tendencies, and the looming conflict that may test the limits of their ordered perfection. The Modrons have existed in their current state for time immemorial, but change approaches even in the realm of absolute constancy. The first and most persistent misconception about Modron nature concerns their fundamental biology, or rather, the assumption that no such biology exists. When a traveler first encounters a Modron on the gears of Mechanus, the impression of artificial construction proves overwhelming. The creature before them appears in perfectly geometric form: cubes, spheres, pyramids, and other mathematical shapes that move with mechanical precision. The sounds they produce suggest grinding gears and clicking mechanisms. Their movements follow trajectories of absolute efficiency, with none of the organic randomness that characterizes living creatures. Every observable detail screams construct, leading even experienced planar travelers to conclude they face nothing more than animated machinery. This conclusion, while understandable, represents a fundamental misreading of Modron nature. Beneath the clockwork exterior exists something that defies easy classification. The Modrons are not constructs at all, but living outsiders native to the outer planes. They possess biological systems that require sustenance. They must breathe air to survive. They need to consume nourishment. Though what constitutes food for a creature that appears to be made of gears and metal remains a matter of considerable scholarly debate. They can be injured, can heal, can die in ways that true constructs cannot. The Modron body, for all its mechanical appearance, functions as a living system subject to the needs and vulnerabilities of biological existence. This revelation raises profound questions about the nature of the Modron form. If they are living creatures, why do they appear so completely mechanical? The answer lies in the fundamental relationship between form and function in outsider physiology. Outsiders, the native creatures of the outer planes, physically embody the philosophical alignments of their home realms. Devils appear in forms that reflect the tyrannical hierarchies of the nine hells. Demons manifest shapes that express the chaotic violence of the abyss. The Modrons, residing in Mechanis, the plane of absolute law and mechanical precision, have evolved, or perhaps were always designed to physically represent these principles. Their geometric forms, their clockwork movements, their mathematical precision in all things are not affectations or disguises. They represent the complete harmony between a creature's essence and its environment. The comparison to inevitables proves instructive in understanding what Modrons are not. The inevitables are true constructs, manufactured beings created in the factory cog of Neumanus through arcane processes involving crystal molds and mystical baths. These beings are literally built, assembled from components according to specifications designed to fulfill specific functions. They do not breathe because they have no need for air. They do not eat because they require no biological fuel. They are machines in the truest sense, animated by magic rather than life. The fact that Modrons so closely resemble these artificial beings, yet remain fundamentally different in their biological requirements, highlights the bizarre nature of their existence. The Modron body represents a bridge between categories that should, by all logical reasoning, remain separate. They possess the outward appearance and behavioral patterns of constructs, while maintaining the internal systems and biological needs of living creatures. This duality is not a contradiction in the context of Mechanis, but rather a perfect expression of the plane's nature. Law, in its ultimate form, unifies and orders all things into harmonious systems. The Modron form achieves precisely this unification, creating beings who are simultaneously mechanical and biological without conflict between these states. They breathe with the regularity of clockwork. They consume nutrition according to mathematical schedules. Even their living processes conform to the absolute order that defines their existence. Scholars who have studied Modron physiology, those few who have managed to examine deceased specimens or gain cooperative subjects, report findings that consistently baffle conventional biological understanding. The internal structure of a Modron does indeed contain components that resemble gears, springs, and other mechanical elements. However, these components appear to be organic in nature, grown rather than forged, biological tissues that have evolved to mimic mechanical forms. Other scholars dispute this interpretation, suggesting instead that Modrons represent a form of life so perfectly ordered that the distinction between biological and mechanical becomes meaningless. Their organs function like machine parts because function and form have achieved absolute unity. Their tissues appear metallic because the concept of tissue in a Modron context means something fundamentally different than it does in other creatures. The territorial domain of the Modrons within Mechanis provides crucial insight into their nature and priorities. Unlike most civilizations that expand, contract, or shift their boundaries based on population pressures, resource availability, or strategic considerations, the Modrons maintain absolute constancy in their spatial footprint. The realm of Regulus, their home within the infinite complexity of Mechanis, encompasses exactly 64 cogs from the great interlocking gears that comprise the plane. This number represents far more than a simple geographic measurement. It embodies the Modron approach to existence itself. The significance of the number 64 within Modron society extends beyond mere territorial control. Mathematics scholars recognize 64 as 2 raised to the 6th power, a perfect square of 8, a number rich with mathematical relationships and symmetries. In a society where mathematical precision defines all aspects of existence, such numerical perfection seems hardly coincidental. The Modron hierarchy itself reflects these mathematical principles, with each rank precisely ordered in relationship to those above and below. That their territorial control would also conform to numerically significant parameters follows logically from their fundamental nature. The cogs of Mechanus exist on a scale that dwarfs conventional planetary geography. Each gear in the infinite plane represents a landmass of potentially vast dimensions, with surfaces that can support entire ecosystems, cities, or, in the Modron case, precisely ordered installations dedicated to maintaining their society's functions. The fact that the Modrons limit themselves to exactly 64 of these massive structures, no more and no less, demonstrates a level of self-discipline and adherence to predetermined structure that few other races could maintain. There is no evidence of Modron expansion beyond this boundary, no historical records of territorial growth or contraction, no indication that these limits have ever been tested or transgressed. The 64 cogs comprise Regulus. Regulus comprises the Modron domain. This equation has held true for as long as planar scholars have recorded observations of Mechanus. The internal organization of these 64 cogs remains largely mysterious to outsiders. The Modrons do not welcome visitors to Regulus, and their isolationist tendencies mean that few reliable accounts exist of the realm's interior geography. What little information has been gathered suggests a society of perfect functionality, with each cog dedicated to specific purposes within the greater whole. Some scholars theorize that the cogs serve as homes for different Modron ranks, with the hierarchy physically distributed across the territory in accordance with mathematical principles. Others suggest that each cog performs a specific function necessary to Modron society production, habitation, energy generation, waste processing, all organized into a perfect cycle of 64 interlocking purposes. The precision with which the Modrons maintain their territorial boundaries raises questions about what would happen if external forces attempted to alter these parameters. Mechanus itself operates according to laws of absolute predictability. The gears turn in patterns that can be calculated with mathematical certainty. The Modrons, perfectly adapted to this environment, have established their domain as an equally predictable constant within the plane's geography. But constants, even in realms of absolute law, can face challenges. The cogs of Mechanus are not static real estate, but moving, interlocking components of a cosmic machine. The relationships between gears shift as the great mechanism of the plane operates. How the Modrons maintain control of precisely the same 64 cogs when the plane's geometry itself remains in constant, if predictable, motion represents yet another mystery of their society. Some planar theorists propose that the 64 cogs of Regulus occupy a special configuration within Mechanus, a stable subset of the plane's infinite gears that maintains constant relationships even as the greater mechanism turns. This theory suggests that the Modrons did not arbitrarily choose 64 cogs, but rather identified a naturally occurring stable system within the plane's geometry and claimed it as their own. The number 64, in this interpretation, represents a mathematical reality of Mechanus itself, a perfect subset of gears that maintains coherent relationships within the larger system. The Modrons, with their instinctive understanding of mathematical principles, would naturally gravitate towards such a configuration. Alternative theories suggest more active Modron involvement in maintaining territorial constancy. Perhaps their society dedicates significant resources to ensuring that their 64 cogs remain under their control, despite the shifting relationships of the plane's greater mechanism. This would require sophisticated tracking of gear movements, precise calculations of spatial relationships, and potentially the ability to influence which cogs fall within their jurisdiction as the plane's configuration evolves. Such an undertaking would demand exactly the kind of mathematical precision and unwavering dedication to order that defines Modron society, making it entirely plausible despite the astronomical complexity involved. The philosophical orientation of Modron society reveals perhaps the starkest contrast between these geometric beings and other lawful creatures that share their plane. Mechanus serves as home to multiple races and entities that embody law in various forms, yet the Modrons approach this alignment from a unique and arguably purist perspective. Understanding this philosophy requires examining what the Modrons choose not to do as much as what they actively pursue. The inevitables, those manufactured constructs forged in the foundries of Neumanus, represent law as an active interventionist force. These beings receive specific mandates to uphold universal principles. A Marut hunts those who cheat death through illegal means. A Kolyarut pursues oathbreakers across the planes. The inevitables exist to impose order on the multiverse, seeking out violations of fundamental laws and meting out punishment to transgressors. Their purpose extends outward, projecting lawful principles onto the chaos and disorder that characterizes much of existence. They are law's enforcers, its active agents in a cosmos, constantly threatening to slide toward entropy. The Modrons reject this interventionist approach entirely. Despite residing in the same plane, despite embodying lawful principles just as absolutely as the inevitables, the Modrons demonstrate zero interest in enforcing laws beyond their own borders. They do not pursue criminals. They do not hunt down oathbreakers. They show no concern whatsoever for violations of law committed by other creatures in other places. A devil might break a contract on the doorstep of Regulus itself, and the Modrons would not stir to pursue justice. This is not apathy or tolerance of lawlessness. Rather, it represents a fundamental philosophical distinction about the proper scope of order's application. The Modron philosophy centers on the concept of internalized perfection. Where the inevitables seek to impose order externally, the Modrons pursue it internally. Their entire society functions as a closed system, a perfect clockwork of interlocking parts where each component fulfills its designated function without deviation. The hierarchies are absolute. The relationships are mathematically precise. The operations proceed according to predetermined patterns that never vary. Within the boundaries of Regulus, within the scope of their own society, the Modrons have achieved what the inevitables can only approximate across the wider multiverse: complete, total, absolute order without exception or deviation. This inward focus makes the Modrons unique among lawful races. Most societies that embrace law as a guiding principle do so with some element of evangelism or enforcement. Lawful good civilizations often seek to spread their ordered prosperity to others. Lawful evil empires impose their structure through conquest and subjugation. Even lawful neutral societies typically maintain some interest in how law applies in their dealings with outsiders. The Modrons demonstrate none of these tendencies. They have perfected order within their domain and show no interest in extending that perfection beyond their borders. The chaos and disorder of the multiverse at large simply does not concern them so long as it remains external to their society. This isolationist tendency has significant implications for planar politics and relationships. The Modrons do not form alliances, as alliances require negotiation and compromise concepts fundamentally at odds with their perfect internal order. They do not trade extensively with other planar powers, as trade introduces variables and unpredictability into their systems. They do not seek converts to their philosophy or attempt to demonstrate the superiority of their approach through persuasion or example. The Modrons exist in a state of near-complete isolation, interacting with the wider multiverse only when absolutely necessary and always in ways that minimize disruption to their internal operations. Yet this isolation is not born of weakness or fear. The Modrons do not hide within Regulus because they lack the power to engage with the wider planes. Rather, they recognize that engagement itself represents a form of disorder. Each interaction with external forces introduces variability, unpredictability, chaos into systems designed for perfect operation. The Inevitables accept this contamination as necessary to their mission of imposing order on disorder. The Modrons reject the premise entirely. Why should perfect order concern itself with imperfect chaos? Why should a system functioning with mathematical precision risk corruption through contact with the irregular and unpredictable? The Modron answer to these questions is clear. It should not, and therefore it does not. This philosophy extends even to their response to direct provocations. Historical records contain accounts of planar travelers stumbling into Regulus, either through navigational error or deliberate trespass. The Modron response in such cases proves instructive. They do not punish trespassers for the crime of violation. They do not imprison or destroy intruders as warnings to others. Instead, they simply remove the disruptive element from their system with maximum efficiency and minimal engagement, escorting trespassers to the borders of Regulus and ensuring they depart. The act of trespass itself matters, only insofar as it represents a disruption to their ordered system. Once the disruption is removed, the Modrons return to their perfect functioning as if nothing had occurred. The relationship between the Modrons and the Formians represents perhaps the most significant external pressure currently facing the Clockwork Society of Regulus. Understanding this developing situation requires examination of both races' fundamental natures and how these natures inevitably lead toward conflict, despite neither society harboring inherent aggression toward the other. The Formians present a sharp contrast to Modron philosophy while remaining thoroughly lawful in alignment. These ant-like beings operate according to a hive structure with absolute hierarchy and perfect obedience to their queen. In this respect, they share the Modrons' commitment to ordered society and clearly defined roles within a greater whole. However, where the Modrons maintain static territorial boundaries and focus their energies inward, the Formians are expansionistic by nature. Their society grows, spreads, and claims new territory across the cogs of Mechanus in an endless process of colony establishment and territorial integration. This expansion does not stem from greed or aggression in the conventional sense. The Formians expand because expansion represents a fundamental aspect of their societal structure. Hive societies require territory to support population growth. As Formian colonies mature and populations increase, new cogs must be claimed, prepared, and integrated into the hive's operations. This process continues without end, driven by the biological imperatives of hive reproduction and the organizational requirements of their rigidly structured society. The Formians approach territorial expansion with the same lawful precision that characterizes everything else about their civilization. They do not raid or pillage. They claim territory through systematic processes, establish it through organized labor, and defend it with coordinated military precision. The inevitable collision between Formian expansion and Modron constancy represents an unstoppable force approaching an immovable object. The Formians continue their relentless spread across Mechanus, claiming cog after cog in their eternal growth. The Modrons maintain absolute control over their 64 cogs, a number that cannot and will not change. Mathematics alone dictates that these two forces must eventually intersect. As the Formians expand their territory, the probability of their claimed cogs bordering Regulus approaches certainty. And once that border is established, the question becomes not whether conflict will occur, but when and how it will manifest. Planar scholars debate what form this conflict might take. Some theorize that the Formians, upon reaching the borders of Regulus, will attempt negotiation or simply divert their expansion around the Modron territory. This theory assumes rational calculation on the Formians' part that facing an enemy of unknown strength, maintaining a fixed defensible position, they would choose the path of least resistance and expand in directions that do not threaten Modron holdings. However, this assumption may underestimate the compulsive nature of Formian expansion. For a hive society operating on biological imperatives, optimal territory might not be easily abandoned simply because it happens to border another power's holdings. Other scholars predict direct military confrontation as the only realistic outcome. The Formians have demonstrated willingness to fight for contested territory against other Mechanus inhabitants. Their military organization rivals anything else on the plane, with warrior castes bred specifically for combat and tactics refined through countless territorial conflicts. When Formian interests collide with Modron boundaries, these scholars argue neither side's fundamental nature permits compromise. The Formians cannot stop expanding without ceasing to be Formians. The Modrons cannot yield territory without abandoning the mathematical precision that defines their existence. War becomes not merely likely but inevitable, a logical outcome of incompatible foundational principles. What remains entirely unknown is the Modron capacity for warfare. Their isolationist tendencies mean that virtually no reliable intelligence exists regarding their military capabilities. Do they maintain standing armies? Have they developed weapons and tactics suited to defending their territory? Or does their society, so perfectly ordered for internal functioning, lack the organizational structures necessary for external combat? The Modrons' appearance as geometric constructs tells observers nothing about their combat potential. A cube-shaped Modron might be a formidable warrior or a helpless administrator. The form provides no clear indication of function in this regard. The few historical accounts that touch on Modron combat capabilities prove frustratingly vague and contradictory. Some travelers report witnessing Modron formations that suggested military organization, with geometric beings arrayed in precise patterns that might represent tactical deployments. Others describe Regulus as entirely civilian in character, with no evidence of military preparation or defensive installations. This contradiction might reflect the observer's limited access to Modron territory, seeing only what the Modrons permitted them to see. Alternatively, it might suggest that Modron military capacity exists in forms so alien that conventional observers fail to recognize it as such. The mathematical precision that characterizes all Modron activities could prove either an advantage or a liability in warfare. Perfect coordination, absolute obedience to tactical plans, and complete predictability in execution could make Modron forces devastatingly effective against less organized opponents. However, that same predictability could be exploited by enemies who learn the patterns and develop counters. The Formian hive mind provides its own form of perfect coordination, potentially creating a conflict where two perfectly ordered forces clash in a contest of competing mathematical perfections. Perhaps most intriguing is the question of how conflict with the Formians might affect Modron society itself. Their isolationist philosophy has insulated them from external pressures for uncounted ages. War with the Formians would necessarily require extensive external engagement, reconnaissance of enemy positions, adaptation to enemy tactics, possibly even negotiation or alliance building with other Mechanus powers. Each of these activities introduces variability and unpredictability into Modron operations. The very act of defending their perfect order against external threat might require compromises that corrupt that order from within. Whether the Modrons would accept such corruption as necessary, or whether they would find some alternative approach that maintains their philosophical purity while addressing the military threat, remains to be seen. The Modrons stand as living contradictions, embodiments of paradoxes that should not be possible yet undeniably exist. They are biological creatures that appear mechanical, isolationists dwelling at the heart of a major planar crossroads, beings of perfect law who show no interest in enforcing it beyond their borders. Understanding the Modrons requires abandoning conventional frameworks for categorizing intelligent life and accepting that some forms of consciousness operate according to principles so fundamentally alien that they resist easy comprehension. The clockwork exterior that defines Modron appearance represents perhaps the most accessible entry point into their alien nature, yet even this obvious feature conceals layers of complexity. These are not constructs masquerading as living beings, nor living beings disguised as constructs. They occupy a category that synthesizes both states into something unique living mechanisms whose biological processes conform to mathematical precision, whose organic functions operate with clockwork regularity. This synthesis of categories represents the physical manifestation of law taken to its ultimate expression, where the boundaries between different types of existence dissolve into perfect unity. The territorial fixation on 64 cogs reveals the Modron relationship with mathematics as something more profound than mere preference or cultural value. The number 64 is not a goal the Modrons pursue or a limit they reluctantly accept. It is a fundamental constant of their existence, as unchangeable as the geometric forms their bodies assume. This unwavering constancy in all things distinguishes the Modrons from virtually every other civilization in the multiverse. Where other societies grow, adapt, and change in response to circumstances, the Modrons maintain perfect stasis. They have achieved what they consider the optimal configuration and see no reason to deviate from it, regardless of external pressures or opportunities. The isolationist philosophy that prevents Modron engagement with the wider multiverse represents perhaps their most distinctive characteristic. By choosing to perfect order within their domain rather than impose it without, the Modrons have carved a unique niche among lawful beings. They serve as proof that law does not require evangelism or enforcement to achieve its purest expression. The Inevitables pursue order through constant intervention, hunting violators across the planes in endless campaigns to impose structure on chaos. The Modrons achieve order through perfect isolation, creating a closed system where chaos cannot enter and disorder cannot arise. Both approaches serve law, but through diametrically opposed methodologies. The looming conflict with the Formians tests whether this isolation can be maintained indefinitely. The Modrons have existed in their current state for ages, but the expanding Formian hives represent a pressure that cannot be ignored or removed through simple border control. When two forces operating on incompatible fundamental principles occupy the same space, conflict becomes not merely probable, but inevitable. The outcome of such conflict will reveal truths about Modron nature that their isolation has kept hidden. Will they prove formidable warriors defending their perfect domain? Will they adapt their society to meet the threat, introducing the flexibility and variation that warfare demands? Or will their rigid adherence to predetermined structure prove a fatal vulnerability against a more adaptable foe? The questions surrounding Modron nature extend far beyond the immediate tactical concerns of potential Formian conflict. These geometric beings embody fundamental questions about consciousness, order, and the nature of life itself. Can a being maintain individuality while conforming absolutely to predetermined patterns? Does perfect order allow for growth and development, or does it require static perfection? What is the relationship between form and function in creatures that have achieved complete unity between their physical bodies and philosophical principles? The Modrons provide no easy answers to these questions. Their isolation ensures that they remain enigmas, their true nature obscured behind geometric forms and mathematical precision. For adventurers and scholars who encounter the Modrons, either within Regulus or during the rare occasions when these beings venture beyond their territorial boundaries, the experience invariably proves unsettling. There is something fundamentally disturbing about creatures that seem so utterly devoid of randomness, spontaneity, or unpredictability. Interaction with Modrons highlights how much of conventional social interaction depends on variables, the subtle variations in tone, expression, and behavior that communicate emotion and intent. The Modrons possess none of these variables. They communicate in mathematical precision, respond according to predetermined protocols, and operate with a consistency that feels less like conversation and more like executing a program. Yet to dismiss them as mere automatons, as biological robots following programming without understanding, would be a profound error. The Modrons possess intelligence, consciousness, and purpose. Their awareness operates according to principles foreign to mortal minds, but awareness it remains. They understand their role within the greater whole of their society. They execute their functions with knowledge of how those functions contribute to the system's operation. They exist not as passive components, but as active participants in the grand clockwork of their civilization. That their participation looks nothing like agency, as most creatures understand it, does not diminish its reality. The Modrons ultimately represent one of the multiverse's most successful experiments in absolute order. They have achieved what few other civilizations even attempt: a society of perfect functionality where every component operates in precise harmony with every other component, where deviation and disorder have been eliminated not through oppression but through fundamental design. Whether such perfection can survive contact with the chaos and variability of the wider multiverse remains an open question. The Formian expansion may provide an answer, forcing the Modrons to either adapt their perfect systems or defend them against an opponent that matches their lawful precision while lacking their philosophical constraints. The clockwork enigmas of Mechanus continue their geometric dance across the 64 cogs of Regulus, maintaining the patterns they have followed since time immemorial. Whether those patterns will adapt to changing circumstances, or whether the Modrons will maintain their constancy regardless of cost, only time will reveal. What remains certain is that these living constructs, these biological mechanisms, these isolationist embodiments of mathematical precision, represent something unique in all the multiverse proof that law, taken to its ultimate expression, creates forms of existence that challenge every assumption about what life can be.